Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our latest instalment of our Life Sciences Legal Forum. These are sort of quarterly sessions where we debate hot topics within the life sciences. Today, we're going to talk about borderline products. Why are we doing this? We've had requests at previous sessions to run an event, a webinar around borderline products. The other reason we're doing this is actually given how the sector is developing its products, we are seeing much more focus on classification of borderline products and the like, and we thought it was probably useful to try to sort of pull this all together today. As I mentioned, this is our latest instalment of our Life Sciences Legal Forum. You will all receive a feedback form at the end of the session. Please do fill it in. Tell us how we're doing. Tell us and give us some sort of subjects for some future sessions as well. We should have time at the end for some questions, but we're very happy to sort of take those as we go. So if you use the Q&A function, please, on Zoom. We'll look to try and take those questions as we go. So today's session is around borderline products. So I suppose sort of when we're stepping back and sort of thinking through what is a borderline product in the context of the life sciences, it's really those products that are difficult to distinguish from medicines or devices, for example, and may function for a medicinal purpose or a medical purpose, but also another purpose, such as a cosmetic purpose, a nutritional purpose. And so really it's at that cross section in terms of sort of stepping over into a regulated product or having a product or technology whereby you've got potentially sort of dual protection. And we were sort of thinking through those kinds of issues this morning. We'll probably come sort of, you'll see this as sort of almost recurring themes as we go through, but there will be a number of factors that will need to be considered in making a product determination, such as stated or intended purpose of the product, taking into account the way it may be presented, mode of action, product claims, and I'm sure we'll come to this in terms of presentation and promotion. But also whether there are similar licensed or registered products on the market and they've already been ruled upon. And we'll sort of debate these issues as we go through today. What we thought we would do, because it's such a broad area, you get into herbal medicines, biocides, etc., is really try to focus on some of those borderline products that we are seeing most within our own practice areas. And we'll get into those in a bit more detail. But before we do that, I'd like to introduce my panelists. They're all regulatory experts within this space. And what I'd like them to do is introduce themselves, but then just so we can start to bring this to life, to give an example, brief example of a sort of a borderline product, maybe their favorite borderline product, but maybe also one that they see a lot of in practice. So you'll start to sort of see the flow of the discussion. But if I go to Steph first, then Isabel, and then Katrina. So Steph.
Thanks, James. Hi, everybody. So I'm Stephanie Caird, partner in the team at Mills & Reeve. I do a lot in the medical devices space, so software as a medical device, AI as a medical device, and there's a bit of a boom in those kind of health and wellness related apps since the pandemic. And IQVIA report said that at the end of 2024, we had over 330,000 different types of health apps on the market, which isn't really surprising because we've been moving more towards telehealth provision. Virtual wards are on the rise as well, so monitoring of patients in the community. And there's an awful lot of apps around that are there for treatment and monitoring of patients. We're also now seeing diagnostics, so about 100 digital diagnostic tools, and the FDA had over 1,000 AI as a medical device apps towards the end of 2024. So there's a lot going on in this space. The borderline between what is a health app and what is a medical device app is the bit that I get quite involved with. Now we have lots of kind of consumer testing. People want to find out who their ancestors are, what their genetic makeup is, what their microbiome is doing. So there's a lot of self-service information that is going on where you have test kits with an app that tells you a breakdown of what's going on, and when that starts shifting into kind of diagnostic or is used for monitoring or treatment of a known condition, that's where the borderline issues crop up. So that's the bit that I find most interesting at the moment.
Thank you, Steph. Isabel.
I'm Isabel Teare. I'm a senior legal advisor in the life sciences team at Mills and Reeve, and I suppose my key area of focus really is medicinal products, and also look at medical devices. But yeah, the border between those two product areas is very interesting at the moment. We have, for example, we've got combination products where you have a medicine that's incorporated in or somehow part of a device, and the two of them have to be used together, and that presents difficulties in the regulatory analysis and the product characterization. And another area where you've got the sort of device and medicine overlay is companion diagnostics. So in that situation, you've got a diagnostic product which is necessary to determine whether a particular medicine is going to be suitable for that class of patients. I mean, the main well-known example there is the HER2 positive breast cancer, which has to be detected through use of a companion diagnostic before you can determine whether it's appropriate for Herceptin treatment. So that's where the two products have to be working together, and they essentially have to be approved together as a pair. And then another area that's really interesting at the moment is the advanced therapies area, where you've got the development of products that usually they would be considered medicines, but there are some sort of tissue and cell-based products that can sometimes fall outside of that medicinal product category. So I suppose those are some of the areas that are hot at the moment from my perspective.
Thank you, Isabel. Lost my mute button there. Katrina.
Hi, everybody. I'm Katrina Anderson. I'm also a regulatory lawyer, but my focus is a little bit different in the sense that I'm primarily an advertising lawyer, and I advise on consumer protection and foods, and basically products that normally are not intentionally brought to market as medicines or medical devices. But what I'm increasingly finding is that this borderline issue is coming up because for often my food supplements clients or my cosmetics clients, they are wanting, for very good commercial reasons, to really push that boundary and make stronger and stronger either kind of wellness claims in the cosmetic space or perhaps health claims, which are distinct from medical claims, in the food supplement space. But they are pushing up against that boundary. And as James mentioned at the beginning, if you push too far and start making medicinal claims, you can actually pull what would not typically be a medicinal product or a medical device into that regulatory sphere. And that's where we're finding those kind of borderline issues. And sometimes, in addition to regulators that typically do deal with cosmetics and consumer products and foods, we're also having the MHRA involved in these issues. So that's where I'm seeing the kind of really interesting developments and tensions. And because we're seeing more and more of those decisions coming out of the regulators, we're learning more and more about where the line is with the borderline products, which is fascinating.
Right, fantastic. So I think that hopefully sort of sets the scene. As I say, there is the Q&A function on Zoom, so do post questions as we go through. I'd like now to sort of delve down into these areas in a lot more detail. So you've seen sort of Steph is going to really focus around medical devices, interaction with health apps. Isabel's going to talk about that intersection between drugs and devices and pick up some of the issues around ATMPs. And then Katrina's going to focus in and around health supplements, cosmetics, and look at those sorts of issues. So almost we're looking at in that sort of that circle, going from devices through to medicines, out the other side in terms of health supplements and into consumer products, and you almost sort of get back around to software apps as well. So that's what we're wanting really to do. So if I can ask each of the panelists really just to focus on those specific areas and maybe sort of talk through what are those key issues to be thinking through. How are these products regulated, by who? So maybe if I turn to Steph first of all, who's gonna look at the device space and say that intersection between sort of unregulated products and regulated products. So Steph.
Yeah, thanks, James. So in the UK, the core piece of legislation for your medical devices is the Medical Device Regulations 2002. That covers the kind of traditional hard medical devices like scalpels, MRI scanners, etc. But it also covers software products, and it also covers in vitro diagnostic medical devices. In the European Union, we have two different pieces of regulation for those types of products. So you have the medical device regulation and the in vitro diagnostic medical device regulations. They came into effect after our transition period. So we didn't take on those new European level regulations. Our regulation is based on the original EU directives relating to the same topic. The regulator in the UK is the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, or MHRA, and they do take enforcement action where they see products being marketed that they believe should be within their remit as medical devices, but they are not currently registered with them. So in order to get your medical device onto the market, you have to have CE or UKCA marking. The MHRA will check that. Some of the key issues that crop up in this area are around what your as a manufacturer of the product, your intended purposes for the product, and also how it works, because the definition of a medical device is linked to the intention of the manufacturer. So a medical device, including software, that is intended by the manufacturer to be used for diagnosis or therapeutic purposes. So one of the key points we need to look at is there a medical purpose behind the product that is being marketed? How is it intended to be used? And the MHRA will look at everything from the packaging, any instructions for use that come with your device, any marketing materials, any advertising, press releases that you make around what you are saying your product is intended to be used for and what it does. If it does everything in a mechanical way, i.e. it's not achieving the principal intended purpose by pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic means, then it's likely to fall in your medical device classification. If it does have any of those actions, then it'll probably fall into the area that Isabel's going to talk to after me. So I won't spoil that. Then, however, if it has got an intended purpose of a diagnosis, you need to look at what is it actually doing, because if your product is going to be analysing a sample, for example, in vitro in order to make that diagnosis, then it might fall into the in vitro diagnostics category rather than the medical device category. And each category has different rules around what you need to do in order to place your product on the market. So having that clarity is really important from the outset, because you want to make sure that you're following the right set of rules. Where things get a bit more complicated is when you have software products, because your software can be a standalone product, or it could be incorporated into a device, and the biggest borderline issues tend to crop up where you have standalone software, particularly if you have it as an app that can be downloaded onto consumer devices, usually an iPad or iPhone. Because those things will be available to end users via the app stores of their relevant handheld devices. So when you are in that software space, you need to be careful about, in terms of your intended purpose, are you going to be monitoring, is usually the one that catches people out, diseases or injuries, or the other one that has been a bit tricky is a control of conception. So a lot of people will know about apps such as Flow, that are very popular for tracking fertility. So whether or not that could be classified as a medical device, in terms of, if you're tracking, is it controlling conception by a mechanical means? So where you look with that intention is when it's tracking, using that example, is it monitoring a disease, or is it just tracking information? So an easy example for this would be in your health app space. You have something like MyFitnessPal or a similar tracker where you can put in what exercise you're doing, what food you're eating, and it'll work out for you what your nutritional values are, what your goals are in terms of how much sugar you should be eating. But the intention of that is to monitor, for you personally, to work out what your overall health goals are. You can have similar apps that will track information around food input. So you put in what food you're eating, and they will then tell you if you're a diabetic user, for example, that you might need to use your insulin injection. In that case, the app is more likely to have a medical purpose, because you're using it, or the intention is for it to be used to identify whether an insulin injection might be necessary for the user. So as well as the kind of intention of the app through marketing is actually looking at what type of disease might it be helping to treat. The other bit to look out for will be things that happen after things have gone to market. Have you got any issues with users? So if it's a health app, likelihood is that you have less of an issue with making sure that consumers are happy with what's happening. If there's a malfunction, that's a simple fix. Where you have a medical device, you have much higher obligations in terms of making sure that it is functioning as intended. And if there are any issues, so for example, you're diabetic, injects too much insulin because your app has miscalculated how much sugar has been eaten, for example, you would need to potentially notify the MHRA of issues around that. So getting it right from the outset can have consequences in the long run as well. So it's not just the putting it on the market, it's also then once it's on the market, if it is a medical device, you need to be more on the ball of making sure that any issues with your products are tracked. So I think those are probably the key issues to watch out for.
That's great. And I think that will be a recurring theme as we go through, won't it? Consistency of approach, consistency of wording around your claims. I'm sure we'll probably come back to it. There is a question in the chat, one probably for Steph. Maybe we'll deal with that later on. If I can probably just come to Isabel to talk about more of that intersection between devices and drugs. And I think, Isabel, you're going to look at combination products, companion diagnostics, and maybe some of the issues we're seeing in the ATMP space.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, James. Thanks, Steph. So the thing is with medicines, as people probably be aware, is just that they're quite tightly regulated. So you have to be really aware if you're going to come within that product category. You have to be clear about that. And the way that a medicinal product is defined, there's a sort of two-limb definition, and it is both how the product is presented and the way in which it functions. So sort of pharmacological mode of functioning rather than the more physical mode of functioning that Steph was talking about. And our legislation in the UK is very close to the EU legislation, which has a sort of similar approach to defining what a medicinal product is. So that legislation in the UK is the Human Medicines Regulations 2012, and you can end up with sort of dual regulation, as I'll come on to, but just you do need to be very clear whether you come within that definition. So the product categories I wanted to talk about, I mean, there are quite a number of possible things to mention, but just looking at the three, the companion diagnostics, the combined products, and ATMPs as just some current issues. So companion diagnostics, I mentioned before that the HER2 positive detection in order to be able to determine suitability for treatment with Herceptin. These kind of companion diagnostics, I mean, it clearly is, the diagnostic product clearly falls within the devices legislation as an in vitro diagnostic, but they attract additional oversight through their overlap with the medicines regime. At the moment in the UK, they are still quite low risk IVD devices. They're considered to be just normal class 1 devices, but we're moving towards the more EU system where they fall within a particular category that's specifically defined as a higher classification of product. And in the EU, you require companion diagnostic approval within the medicines approval process, and the notified body that's involved has to seek a scientific opinion from the European Medicines Agency on the suitability of that companion diagnostic in relation to the approval of that particular medicinal product. So the two things are sort of dealt with together in a joint process, and we do expect to see something more like that for the UK as the changes to the legislation come through. And then turning now to the sort of the combined medicinal products and medical devices and where those sit. Steph has explained a bit about how that medical devices regime works, but just sort of looking at the categories there. So the combination products which are specifically addressed, devices which are used to administer medicinal products. So you can have a fairly simple kind of mode of administration like a syringe, for example, and those kind of products are just regulated as devices. And then you move on to slightly more complex products where, for example, you might have a device and a medicinal product which are combined together to form a single integral product presentation. And there's no intention for reusable or refillable products there. You're presenting a single product. So you might, for example, have an injectable with an antibody medicinal product already within it, and that's only a single-use product. And those will be covered by the medicines legislation, but there will be some requirement to check that they comply with the relevant aspects of the devices legislation, also to make sure that they have the requisite safety and performance features. And then there's a third category where you can have a device which incorporates a substance which, if it were used on its own, would be considered a medicinal product. You might have, for example, a heparin-coated catheter, and products like that will be dealt with under the medicines regulation, the medical devices regulation, sorry, but you have to also ensure that the medicinal product that's forming part of that combined product is up to scratch under the medicinal regulations as well, and that there you'll have the approved body or notified body which carries out the assessment of the device, consulting with the MHRA in relation to those medicinal product aspects. So there's sort of three categories of product there which have to be dealt with slightly differently. There are other similar examples around, for example, insulin injectors, where if you had a disposable pen injector, single use with the integral cartridge, then that would be considered a medicine. Whereas if you had a reusable pen where you could refill it, then that would be a device. And similar considerations around nebulizer type products, where if it's completely incorporated as a single use product, then you have to consider it to be a medicinal product. So yeah, those are a few of the combined product categories that we're seeing more of. And then turning now to the advanced therapy medicinal products category. And this is a class within medicinal products, ATMPs, and they get special treatment within the medicines legislation. And there are surrounding products which can be quite difficult to classify. Tissue and cell-based products can come under other regimes. So there's a sort of boundary area with transplants, transfusions of blood, derived as products, and then some overlap with devices potentially as well. So the key question here is whether the cells or tissues are engineered in some way. If there's no engineering or modification, then they are more likely to fall within the legislation addressing human tissue, so the quality and safety legislation, or the blood safety and quality regulation. So if you're giving a whole blood or a fraction of the blood to treat somebody without extensive modification, then that will be dealt with under that regime. But if you've got cells or tissues that are engineered and either used in a way that's different from their original use in the body, or modified so that they can be used in a different way, then you're getting into the regime of the advanced therapy medicinal products, ATMPs. The legislation refers to three categories. So gene therapies. We've recently actually seen the example of the approval of Casgevy, which is groundbreaking CRISPR-based treatment for people who suffer from sickle cell, for example, where you actually address a genetic problem. Or it could be somatic cell therapy medicinal products, where you manipulate some cells or tissues that have been donated, or they could be from the same individual and put back into the same patient, or tissue engineered products. So here we're going to be dealing with ATMPs, and there may also be a requirement for involvement from either the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, if you're dealing with gametes or embryos, or the Human Tissue Authority, if you're dealing with tissues and cells. And so you need to get the sort of these authorities working together, and the they do cooperate quite closely. So the MHRA and the Human Tissue Authority do collaborate in order to get these more difficult product categories approved and available to patients. So a marketing authorization will be needed for an ATMP. There are some ways in which an unlicensed ATMP can be made available through the hospital exemption regime or the specials regime. But in the normal course, you're going to need to go through the medicinal products approval system and gain approval for that product in the usual way. I think, well, there's more to cover, but I think we need to move on in the interest of time. So I'll hand back at that point.
That's great, Isabel. Just to set the scene and put forward those key issues. And I'd like now to turn to Katrina, who we sort of previewed in terms of that intersection between life sciences and other areas such as food. And I think, Katrina, you're going to talk around nutraceuticals and health supplements and cosmetics, and maybe talk a bit about novel foods as well. So
Absolutely. Sorry, Isabel, do you want to? Oh. Not to worry, I just saw your hand up and I thought you were you had a final point to make. But
No, it's fine.
as James said, I am going to talk to you a little bit about where life science intersects with other regulatory regimes. And this comes about in a few different ways. I think the first way it comes about is most of the time unintentionally, or at least perhaps without enough understanding of the regimes. Because as both Isabel and Steph talked about, the medicinal products in one way or another, either through the intention point with the medical devices or the presentation point with medicines, how you put your product on the market, how you speak about it actually affects its regulatory classification, which is not something that is necessarily as well understood as it should be. And what can happen is over time, you can have a product which was brought to market as, say, a cosmetic or maybe a food supplement. And over time, the marketing messaging evolves, and perhaps the marketing team gets a little bit carried away, let's be honest, about what they're saying about the product. And there's a little bit of slippage into what we would broadly call medical claims. And at that point, you might have taken something which has always been regulated as perhaps a food supplement under food supplement regulation, or a cosmetic or a general consumer product in one way or another. And through the way that you talk about it to consumers and explain to consumers what it's for, what it does, how you market it, you actually pull it into a different regulatory regime. And that can happen very often inadvertently, if I'm honest, but also sometimes I think increasingly because consumers have blurred ideas. We increasingly have an idea of wellness, which kind of sits somewhere between, if you like, strictly medicinal and consumers. It can there can be that kind of push into the wellness space can cause problems if it goes too far. And it can particularly cause problems in food, because in normal consumer products or cosmetics or other products which are broadly regulated as general consumer products, there is a fairly sort of binary medical claims, not medical claims line. But in relation to food and food supplements, we have this kind of middle category of health claims, which are not medical claims and they are permitted but are highly regulated. And that kind of middle category can be hard to navigate, especially around what we call general health claims. And then the other area where we see real issues is, as James mentioned, in the novel food space. So what we're talking about here is really cutting edge, often biotech based science. So we're talking about things like cell cultivated meat or specific fermentation or other forms of innovative fermentation. And at the kind of development stage, quite often, there isn't a lot of certainty or a clear decision whether this product is being developed in a way that is going to be brought to market as a medicine, or whether it's going to be brought to market as a food, or for that matter, actually, there are other really interesting innovations. So I've seen startups pivot, for example, into cosmetics, especially if they're developing alternative forms of fat that can replace things like cocoa butter in cosmetics. And at that very early research stage, no clear decision has been made about how you bring something to market. In actual fact, you might bring to market the same product in a number of different regulatory ways. So you might bring it to market as a food, you might bring it to market as a medicine and also a cosmetic simultaneously. We see that very often in relation, for example, to CBD and other cannabis-related products. But the key point is, again, there is something slightly different about food, which if you're dealing with something that is so high tech that it doesn't have what we call a history of human consumption prior to 1997, then actually you, in addition to complying with food regulatory regimes generally, you need something called a novel foods authorization. And there are quite a lot of regulatory developments in that space, specifically focusing on some of these issues. But it's fair to say novel foods are a whole webinar in themselves. So I'm gonna park that one for now, and just spend the rest of my time before we go on to Q&A and some of the wider issues, just talking about where we're seeing the hot topics at the moment and how to manage those. So I think the first thing I would say is, if you are dealing with a product which could potentially be presented or marketed as a sort of somewhat medicinal product, you need to be really, really tight with your marketing and keep your marketing team on a frankly quite short leash. And it's being very clear about what line you're going to tread, both in terms of the words you're going to use. So make sure that you are staying the right side of the line in terms of kind of medicalized terminology. So it is an important distinction if you are talking about, say, acne versus spots. Acne is a medical condition that will tend to take you towards classification in the medical realm. Spots, just something everyone has. So that it's important to get clear with your marketing team which words they should be using, which words they shouldn't. And also how you combine that with imagery is really important, because the regulators in this space don't just look at the words you say, but they also look at the overall presentation and how it's presented. And if you start to use imagery which suggests medical sort of treatment or medical diseases, even if your words are right, so even if you stayed the right side of the line on the spots, if you throw in a picture of someone in a white coat with a stethoscope around their neck, that's going to be taken to be understood by a consumer as a doctor, which is again going to take you down the path of potentially imagery which suggests that this is medical. And that's when you start to get letters from regulators, which could be people like the Advertising Standards Authority, it could be trading standards, but also I've dealt with situations where businesses who are intending to bring products to market as a food actually get letters from the MHRA saying that we think you are presenting this as a medicine. And even if that initial letter doesn't come from the MHRA, regulators work together behind the scenes. So it is extremely common for the ASA in these cases to go and get an opinion from the MHRA. And so they will become aware of these issues if you're not kind of treading the right side of the line. And there's lots, because of this interest in this wellness space, there's lots of guidance and rulings out there. So if you do need to sort of work out how to tread that line, there's a lot of material that we can use to help support you on that. And I think just finally, before I finish my session and hand back to James for Q&A, I just wanted to talk about buzzwords, because this kind of borderline space, it has sort of slightly I suppose it reacts to the consumer domain. You know, what is current, what is big, what is a buzzword right now. And so we're seeing a lot of issues, for example, around menopause claims at the moment. And all the regulators have been extremely clear that talking about treating the symptoms of menopause is definitely a medical claim. So if your product is not regulated as a medicine or a medical device. Those claims are not available to you. So you have to be really, really careful about what you say about things like menopause. It seems like the next evolving issue we're seeing in that sort of space is probably likely to be PCOS. Seems to be the sort of the new area. But we've also got some old favorites like probiotics, which continue to be extremely difficult to talk about in a food space and take you into very difficult territories. I think I'm going to hand back to James now. So
Fantastic. Yeah, that's really useful. So we've got a few other questions, I think, to work through, but I quite like now just to pause because we have a number of questions coming in, mainly around classification. So the first question, and this one is probably for Steph. So in your view, if a synthetic wig is suitable for use by patients suffering alopecia caused by chemotherapy or other reasons, does this make the wig a medical device as per UK MDR or a general consumer product? By the way, the wigs are not stimulating hair growth or preventing hair loss. So, Steph, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, my initial reaction to that is it's probably not going to be a medical device, but it will come down to what the primary intended purpose of the manufacturer is. So, if the primary intended purpose is just they are making synthetic wigs, which can be used by anybody who has hair loss or just fancies wearing wigs rather than their natural hair, likelihood is it's not a medical device. If the primary purpose is that you intend these to be used by patients, then you might start straying more into the medical device regime. But generally, things like wigs would not be considered a medical device.
Great, thank you. Lots of nods from other panelists on that one. So, Isabel, do you want to take question two? So, if you combine a specials medicine such as medicinal cannabis, obviously we could have done a whole session around CBD, and maybe we will do a future event. But if you combine that specials medicine with a medical device, must the device have a CE or UKCA mark? Isabel, is that one for you?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Because it's a specials medicine, we're sort of taking it outside the regulatory regime to some extent, and we're relying on the individual prescriber to make the right decision for that particular patient and get something made up to their order. But the prescriber themselves will have requirements that they have to comply with in terms of proper treatment of an individual patient. And I would expect that they would want to see a medical device used in that kind of situation, something that's been properly authorized. But I don't, as far as I'm aware, there isn't a clear answer to that question, but I would expect that prescriber to want to see approval of the delivery product.
Great, fantastic. I think the remaining questions, I think it's a mix of probably Katrina and Isabel, the next one. So, if an early stage, I'll keep the flow going with the questions because I think they're coming and they're all really interesting questions from a classification perspective. So if an early stage preclinical topical medicine being developed for a skin condition was shown to have a cosmetic effect, where or when would you see the split?
I think you'd have to make a decision, wouldn't you, during the course of the development process as to which route you thought was the most suitable, or indeed you could pursue both routes and have two separate products that you're going to be developing. But you have to make it very clear that they must be marketed separately. And if you are going to market something as a medicinal product, then clearly you'd have to go through the proper approval process. Yeah, but I can envisage a situation, Katrina, I don't know if you agree, where you develop them in parallel.
Yeah, and I mean, we do have situations. So one individual product has to be either a cosmetic or a medicine, if you see what I mean. So you can't be regulated under both. You make a choice. But we do have lots of situations, and the courts have confirmed that this is acceptable, where if you take a cosmetic, if you like, effectively the same stuff in the bottle is being marketed under different brands as a medicine and as a cosmetic. So it is possible to market as both, but not under the same brand. But the other thing I would say is, if you are going to pursue that sort of strategy, you need to be really tight and clear on your marketing and have a really clear separation in your branding and your marketing of what you're doing. And I would encourage you probably not to have any kind of like overarching, sub brands, if you like. I think it needs to be cleaner and more distinct than that, because the regulatory regimes just don't. You've got to kind of pick your regime and stick within it effectively.
And if the ingredients are sort of intrinsically acting in a medicinal manner, then you would be within the scope of the medicines legislation regardless.
Super. And Steph, did you want to make an additional point there?
Yeah, I was just going to add, in terms of the kind of being really clear, as Katrina said, in terms of the distinction, can also have an impact on your kind of additional regulatory compliance requirements, because if you're in the medicines space, you might fall within your ABPI code compliance requirements in terms of your interactions.
Yeah, absolutely. One final question now, and then hopefully we're going to take the others at the end, because the questions are flooded in, but all really interesting questions. But this one I think is specifically for Katrina. So I understood that if because cosmetic product is intended to be applied on a spot to treat the spot, this will be considered as a medicine. Your view, question mark.
I mean, I think the first question you would have to ask, and this is really a question for Isabel, is your product intrinsically a medicine, such that it can't be marketed as a cosmetic? But I mean, there definitely are cosmetic. It is possible to have cosmetic products on the market which are there for spots, as opposed to acne, just to be absolutely clear, the medical condition. I don't inherently see the fact that it is something that is designed to be dabbed on a spot as opposed to all over your face, would necessarily prevent you bringing it to market for a cosmetic. But I would definitely, the right order to think about this is to consider the medical question first. And the answer to that could be, it absolutely has to be a medicine, or it could be that it's more about the presentation, such that it could fall into that borderline space of it could be brought to market as either, and you have a choice. And then that's effectively a commercial question. Do you think that the commercial opportunity of bringing this to market as a cosmetic and the advantages of being more freely available and easier to advertise, but with less punchy claims, are worth the trade-off? And that is a very cosmetic, commercial / marketing decision.
The regulators will sometimes look at what similar products, how they have been treated. So if other products with the similar contents are being approved as medicinal products, I think it'd be very difficult then to pursue a different route for your product.
I'd like to come back to some of there are some other questions which I think we'll sort of deal with in the last 5 minutes. But before we do that, there were two other sort of themes I wanted to explore, and maybe we can sort of answer those collectively now. The first is we've focused specifically around product regulatory, but clearly there are other legal regulations we need to be thinking about, and I'd be quite interested in terms of getting the panel's perceptions around that, because it's not just looking at product classification, it's looking at the wider legal framework, which is going to impact the ability to develop and commercialize. So that's the first question, and maybe turn to Steph on that. And the second question, I think, is so we know the life sciences, it's focused around collaborations. We're working with partners, maybe around co-development, maybe around out licensing. And I was sort of keen to get the panelists' view in terms of some of those sort of key watch areas in relation to that. How do you manage that? Because we obviously know that, particularly in the co-development sense, a product it's quite a dynamic thing. It will develop over time. Regulatory position may not be clear until further down the line. So I'm keen just in the next 5 minutes just to get people's views on that. Steph, do you want to kick off possibly
Yep.
on that first point?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So in terms of kind of other regulations that you might need to be thinking about when you're developing these types of products, the ones that are very close to my area are things like data privacy, because your software as a medical device, AI as a medical device, are likely to be handling patient information. So you need to make sure that everything that you do from that standpoint is GDPR and Data Protection Act compliant. That's regulated by the Information Commissioner's Office, and they have got some guidance around AI use, for example. If you have a software as a medical device product that could also be allowing remote treatment of patients, you might fall into CQC related regulatory provisions. In which case you would need to explore those in terms of what registrations you need, what relevant healthcare professionals you would need to employ in order to provide your product. Some things that are probably swaying towards Katrina's bag are in the kind of consumer rights space.
Yep.
Because there are certain requirements relating to software specifically that you need to take into account, and then advertising regimes that, Katrina, I don't know if you want to say anything extra on advertising.
Yeah, I feel like I've talked about advertising quite a lot. I think the only extra points I would make is just to say, obviously, if you are regulated as a medicine or as a food, to rather a lesser extent a cosmetic, there are some very specific rules that apply to you, but this does not exempt you from the rest of advertising compliance. So there is a much wider piece about how you comply with advertising generally. So don't limit your thinking on advertising to the specific issues about communicating the medicinal parts of your product. There are wider issues to consider. The other thing I would just say more generally in the consumer space, if you are selling to consumers, we are seeing a lot of developments in that space. At the moment, we've got this big new piece of legislation, Digital Markets Competition and Consumer Act, which is going to bring in a whole new regime for selling via subscriptions, which will often be relevant for apps and kind of medical devices. So if you are looking at subscription business models, direct to consumers, that's important. And there's also a load of new compliance obligations around reviews. And again, probably most likely to come up in the app space. Reviews are very important on app stores and such like. And the new rules have come into effect on that. There's a grace period of 3 months, but we started at the beginning of April. So by July, you will need to be in compliance. And effectively, that's going to be a little bit like having a reviews privacy policy. So if that's not on your radar, that's definitely one to start thinking about sooner rather than later.
Thanks, Katrina. And Isabel, you already mentioned in the context of your advanced therapies, there's also potentially considerations around human tissue regulation that you need to be aware of, particularly if you have any kind of sample collection as part of your product.
Yes, so the Human Tissue Act might be relevant. Going back to, I think, James, you were raising the point about collaborations between parties. So if you have a research party and a party that's going to take a product through to marketing, then the one that's going to develop the product for marketing will need to make sure there's adequate provision in the agreement between them to ensure that the research party is complying with the regulations that will need to be demonstrated to the final authority. But also, as the collaboration progresses, you'll need arrangements so that they can take decisions between each other and provide each other with the necessary support during that process. James, did you want to add anything in that sort of area? Oh, you're on mute at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's about contract process as well. So managing change, limiting if you're the IP owner, limiting your your license rights, you've got some checks and balances around that, and obviously sort of factoring in the costs of change and who meets those various costs. But obviously the parties need to be getting together and agreeing the regulatory strategy as part of the development process as well.
Especially if that evolves during the course of the project.
Absolutely, which undoubtedly often it is. I had a similar deal recently where it was around medicines development, and then we had companion diagnostic issues, and it did impact IP treatment as well, because a lot of the patent claims were both focused around diagnosis but also treatment. Maybe in the last few minutes we could just deal with some of the final questions. We've only got about sort of 3 or 4 minutes, so perhaps really quickly on those. And I would sort of say to attendees, if you do have any follow-up question, by all means email us. Rhiannon will send details of all the panelists. Very happy to input around those. So first question, over this one for Isabel: do granted patent claims which cover a product or device impact how the product or device might be perceived by regulatory authorities?
I mean, generally those things are considered separately, and it shouldn't influence the regulator or their analysis. Yeah,
agreed. Second question, again, I don't know whether this is Steph or Isabel: how will the innovative licensing and access pathway impact the areas you have discussed, particularly in relation to drug device combinations?
Yeah, I mean, I can comment briefly on that. I mean, the products within scope of ILAP are quite broadly cast, and I think most drug device combinations would be covered, although there are some exclusions where if you've got drug device combinations with a diagnostic aim as well as immunizations, I think those are specifically excluded. But it is quite broad, that program to bring forward innovative medicines and devices.
Cool. And I think the final question, I think, is for Steph. So question here is more from a deployer of a SAMD or AI as a medical device standpoint, as opposed to manufacturer standpoint. What are the key watch outs we would suggest for those of us who deploy third-party software tool solutions in our own services to use as patients? Any thoughts, Steph?
Yes, thank you. So the first question I would always look or ask is whether or not it is a medical device that is being deployed. So have a conversation with your provider as to what the technology is, what the intended purpose as outlined by the manufacturer is, and then work out whether it is something that is a regulated product, and check that whether they have all of the relevant markings in order to provide you with that product, because we have seen instances where the manufacturer has got it wrong and not got the right classification for their devices, and you wouldn't want to be left on the hook for deploying something where the manufacturer has messed up their regulatory compliance program. And then there's usual kind of contractual provisions around them having to ensure that they have all of the right licenses and approvals, etc., in place. But I would start with the basic of what type of product is it that you're intending to provide.
Fantastic. Really, really insightful. Thank you very much for excellent analysis and insights. I've learned an awful lot. We're there on time. I'd just like to say to attendees, thank you very much for joining this morning. We will send out some feedback forms as well. Please do complete, because it allows us to frame future sessions. But hopefully you found that of use and insightful. All that remains for me to say is a big thank you to the team for this morning. Thank you very much.